We're going to continue in a series about a man who had persevering faith, who trusted in the faithfulness of God, a man named Joseph. This is the third sermon in that series, and if you want to catch up, they're on the internet, on our website. You can check out the last two. Last week, we talked about a number of things. One of the things we talked about was his ornate robe, his ketonet pasim. And we learned that Joseph had at least two dreams from the Lord, two dreams that were prophetic promises. First, he had his Wichita State dream, where they were out in the field shocking grain, and the other brother's shocks of wheat bowed down to his. And then he had another dream where the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to him. And it seems as if those dreams pictured a special future that God had in store for Joseph. God's future for him, His calling on him, His sovereign choice of Joseph, and His blessing on him. And that dream that he told led to his brother's jealousy and ended with them selling him into slavery into Egypt. And that's where we left off with Joseph last week. But I want to ask you a question. When God chooses someone and sets a blessing on them, sets a blessing in store for them, why does He do that? When He blesses someone with certain gifts or certain abilities, well, the Bible says He does it for His purposes. He blesses someone, usually it's not just for them. It's for a greater purpose. He's going to bless like He did with Abraham. He blessed Abraham to bless others. When God allows troubles to come into our life, the same rationale holds true. He allows them to come into our life because He has a plan. He has a purpose. And it's ultimately for blessing, right? We know Romans 8:28. For we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. We're going to see that played out in the life of Joseph over a number of situations over a number of years. Even the hard things, even the things that the devil was doing, even that the sins that other people were committing against him, even the injustice that he went through, God used them. And at the end of the story, you'll hear Joseph say something very profound when he forgives his brothers. He'll say, what the devil meant for harm, God meant for good. When God chose Abraham, Joseph's great-grandpa, He chose him for a blessing. But there was a larger purpose. It was a part of that covenant, wasn't it? I will make you a blessing. I'm going to bless you, and through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That blessing is going to come then through your offspring, through your family, through your children. But if you know the story, you know that Abraham and Sarah got tired of waiting, and that they decided to push God's agenda, to push the blessing, to try to expedite the promise. And that poor decision they made set up a conflict that's still raging today. Throughout all history, there's been conflict because of that decision that they made. But that didn't undo God's plan. His plan still went forward. Isaac was still born. The son of the promise still came. I was struck this morning by an illustration that the Lord gave me about a great giant movie screen. If you can picture a great giant movie screen, much bigger than this building, and there's a scene playing on it, and that's God's purpose. That's God's plan, and it's happening. Have you ever seen a movie where there's a scene and there's like hundreds of extras in it? Maybe even thousands of extras. That used to be the way they promoted these epic movies. They would say a cast of thousands, right? And sometimes there are these scenes in these big epic movies like Ben-Hur or the Ten Commandments or Gone with the Wind, and there's this story that's playing out, but then there's all these little extras in the front of it, right? And they're all doing something. Maybe you can picture like hundreds of people in the front of this movie screen, and they're all playing a part. And maybe some of them are fighting with each other, or some of them are kissing with each other, or some of them are singing. They've all got these things going on. And that's kind of like our life in God's plan. We're playing a role. We've got a part to play. But here's what we do. We get myopic. We think that this is what the movie's about. My little story here. That this is what it's about. And we certainly have free will. We can choose to cooperate with the story, or we can choose to rebel against the story, and that will change things in my little part of the story. But it doesn't change what God's plan is. It doesn't change God's purpose. That He is going to bring that about. And I think it's a way of looking at the sovereignty of God and the free will of man happening at the same time. God's purpose is playing out. And God's purpose has been revealed first to Abraham. This is what's going to happen, Abraham, and it's going to be through your children, through your family, through your offspring. And we've gone down through the generations, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph. We see that God is revealing these things. And every time God reveals something, you know what? The devil's listening. The devil listens and he pays attention. And when God says, Abraham, I'm going to do something great through your family, guess who the devil begins to attack? That family. When God says, I'm going to give you a son, the devil says, well, hey, let me see if I can mess that up. I'll get Abraham and Sarah to do something stupid. And every step of the way, he's always trying to mess things up. But that doesn't derail God's plan. It doesn't derail His purpose. Sometimes it derails us if we fall into that. So we see that God's plan now is being further revealed through these dreams that God revealed to Joseph. And Joseph then tells his father in Genesis 37:10 and 11 about this dream, about the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down. And his father said, he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, I know we talked about that last week, but I want to camp out there for a little bit. His father kept it in mind. His father was thinking about it. He was chewing on it. He was deliberating. He was thinking about this dream that Joseph had. And I can't help but believe, there's no doubt in my mind, that one of the reasons that Jacob kept this dream in mind, this revelation about Joseph, is because earlier, years earlier, a generation earlier, there was a similar revelation made about him, about Jacob, about Joseph's father. So let's put a pause here on the story of Joseph, and we're going to back up. We're going to do a little backstory. We're going to flash back a generation. We're going to go back in time to when Jacob was about to be born. Let's go back to Genesis 25. 21 through 26. Okay, so now we're back to Joseph's grandpa, Isaac. Okay. His wife, Joseph's grandma, Rebekah, was also childless. Isaac prayed to the Lord on his behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayers, and his wife, Rebekah, became pregnant. The babies, so we immediately know she's got twins. The babies jostled with each other inside of her, and she said, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. That's a pretty good doctrine right there. Anytime something's going on, and your tendency is to say, why is this happening to me? We go and inquire of the Lord. What's going on? And the Lord said to her, there's two nations. Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. There's that revelation. There's that special chosen, there's the sovereignty of God playing out, and it's being revealed to Rebekah. The older will serve the younger. The younger is going to be the one who has the blessing. So when the time came for her to give birth, there were two twin boys in her womb. The first one came out, so that's the firstborn, and was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau, which means red. And after this, his brother came out with his hand grabbing Esau's heel. And so he was named Jacob. Jacob means supplanter, it means deceiver, it really means grabber. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to get it for myself, and I'm going to use any means that I can get to take it. Grabber. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Isn't that interesting? That his name meant grabber, and for what we read about Jacob, Joseph's dad, he was a grabber. I'm going to get it. I'm going to take it. it's going to be mine. Now, Rebekah had this promise. The younger one, Jacob, is going to be the one who's blessed. He's going to be the one. The older one's going to serve the younger one. He'd been the recipient of revelations. Jacob was a grabber. Does it put you in mind at all of what's talked about in Philippians about Jesus? That even though he was equal with God, he did not think equality with God was something that had to be grabbed, had to be grasped. King James says he thought it not robbery. The reason why it says it thought it not robbery is like a purse snatcher. Somebody comes along and grabs your purse, right? And Jesus didn't think his divinity was something he had to grab onto. He held on to what God had given him loosely, so when the Father asked him to lay it down, he laid it down. But Jacob was just the opposite. He was, I'm going to get what's mine. I'm going to grab it. Which may have been what was going through his mind, and even maybe justifying his actions when Esau came in from the field and was hungry. You remember that story? And Jacob saw an opportunity. I'm going to take advantage of my brother, and I'm going to steal his birthright. I'm going to get him, I'm going to trick him, I'm going to swindle him. I'm going to get him to sell me his birthright for a pot of stew, and I'm going to grab what's mine. May have been what was in Rebekah's mind even, because it was really Rebekah's plan that got Jacob to deceive his father Isaac. Remember when he went in had the skins on him and he stole the blessing for the firstborn. And maybe because Jacob because why are we talking about Jacob? I thought we were preaching about Joseph. Right? Well, remember our little verse there? It said Jacob kept these things in mind. So when Joseph had that dream, the other brothers are going to bow down to me. A light bulb went off and he said, man, this sounds familiar. I remember this in my life. My mom had a word like that about me. And I know all the upsides of being God's chosen, and I know all the downsides that have come into my life because I didn't handle that right. And maybe Jacob spoke into Joseph's life. You see, Jacob lived his life trying to obtain something that God had freely given him. Chew on that for a minute. God had told him, I'm going to bless you, you're going to have a blessing. But instead of receiving that from God and waiting for that and trusting for that and resting in that, he through his own efforts was trying to always grab it. He was trying to always get it. Plotting and scheming and grabbing. He lived up to his name, deceiver. He deceived his brother Esau. He deceived his father Isaac. He planned and schemed his way to get a blessing and a birthright. And he got the blessing and he got the birthright, but he could never enjoy it. You realize that? He got his brother to sell him his birthright. He tricked his dad to give him the blessing, but he could never enjoy it. Instead, he had to flee and live his life a stranger with his uncle Laban, working like a hired hand. He never enjoyed what he grabbed. He never got the blessing he tried to obtain with his own cleverness. It eluded him. He never did get it until one night when he sought the Lord. A night when Jacob feared for his life because his brother Esau was coming. The brother that he had tricked so many years before, coming to meet him. And Jacob, that night, thought, this is it. This is the end. I'm going to lose my life. I'm going to lose my flocks. I'm going to lose my herds. I'm going to lose my wives. I'm going to lose my kids. I'm going to lose everything. We read about that life-changing night in Genesis 32. Now, I know that Joseph knew this history about his dad. This isn't something that the 12 sons of Jacob would not have known about their dad. You know why I know that they knew? Because at the end of this night, Jacob is going to wind up with a limp, and it says he limped the rest of his days. Every day of his life he limped because of what happened to this night. And If your dad walked with a limp the whole time you were growing up, don't you suppose you would know why? Why did that happen to my dad? So this is the story. Jacob's coming back. He's fled Laban's house. He's coming back to his homeland. He's sent messengers ahead to try to kind of persuade Esau to assuage him a little bit. And the messengers returned and said, "We went to your brother Esau, and he is now coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Now, why would somebody bring 400 men? Because there's going to be a fight. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. Just put a pause there for a minute. You guys know this story. You know how it's going to end. There's not going to be a fight. But I'm not so sure that there wasn't going to be a fight. I'm not so sure that when Esau left with the 400 guys that wasn't in his mind. And the Lord changed that situation. I don't know that for sure. But in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. And he thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, maybe the other group that's left may escape. And then Jacob prayed, "Oh God, God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and to your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, going that direction. Now coming back, I have become two camps. You've blessed me. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and I will make your descendants like the sand of the sea." Same promise that he gave to his great-grandpa and his grandpa and his dad, which cannot be counted. Jacob finally comes to the end of his ability to fix things. The end of his ability to manipulate and scheme and plot and finagle. And he calls on the Lord, and he recalls the promises that God has made to him. He says, "God, you said this." Isn't this a picture of grace theology versus works theology? I can't do it. I can't fix it. I can't deal with the enemy. I'm going to stop, and I'm just going to put my faith in God. Now he's prayed and he's sent gifts. But as far as he knows, Esau is still coming. Verse 22 through 26 speaks of later that night. Jacob got up and he took his two wives and his two female servants, that's Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. So his wife, his kids, all his stuff's on that side of the river. He comes back across this side of the river. He's by himself that night. A man wrestled with him till daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." See, that's the blessing that he'd been trying to grab all of his life. The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob, I'm the grabber," he answered. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, supplanter, grabber, deceiver, but Israel, because you have a struggle with God and with humans, and you have overcome, you have prevailed." He changes his name. He gets a new identity. You've prevailed because you finally had that blessing that I told your mom the day before you were born that you were going to get. A blessing that hasn't come by all your striving, by all your working, by all your trying, all your grabbing. all your scheming, your planning, your manipulation, all your mother's attempts to make it happen, all those plans to expedite the promise, everything you tried and grabbed slipped through your fingers. But this blessing has become now to you because you've grabbed hold of me and you won't let go of me. Not because of your ability. It's a victory that has come because I humbled you. It's a kind of a neat little story, isn't it? Because it says the man that was wrestling with Jacob, which was actually the Lord was wrestling with Jacob. It says Jacob wouldn't let go of him. The Lord could have got loose of him at any moment. Why? How do I know that? Because when it was time, he all he had to do was reach out and touch him. Just touched him. And his hip was out of socket. Dislocated his hip. The Lord could have disengaged from him at any time, but He didn't. He wrestled with him all night. Aren't you thankful for a Lord that doesn't disengage from us until He blesses us? And at that moment then, now think about where Jacob is. It's the night before he thinks he's going to have to fight the battle of his life. When he needs the most strength he's ever had. God, if there's ever a time I need to be strong, it's now. And what does God do? He dislocates his hip. He can't even stand upright. He can't fight worth a nickel. He has no ability now to defend himself. He's completely dependent on the Lord, and that's where his blessing comes. That place of humility at the end of yourself. That's when you overcome. That's when you prevail. That's when your identity changes finally from I'm going to grab this to I'm going to trust God. And that's when his name went from Jacob to Israel. From deceiver, grabber, to overcomer. So that's the history of Joseph's dad, why he walks with a limp. That's the story that Jacob told his sons. That's why when you flash forward now a generation and Joseph has this dream that says your brothers are going to bow down to you, Jacob keeps it in mind. Somehow, by God's grace, Joseph learned from his dad's mistakes. And he learned about his grandma Rebecca's mistakes. Isn't it glorious when the generation below us doesn't have to make the mistakes that we made? When a generation breaks a pattern, when a family stronghold is broken, when after years of alcoholism, somebody isn't an alcoholic. When after years of divorce, somebody stays married. You know why that happens? Jesus. That's why that happens. There's nothing else that can break those chains. Somehow by God's grace, Joseph is not going to have the attitude that was prevalent in his previous generations. And here was the attitude: I've had a blessing promised me and I can send my way to get it. Did you know you can never send your way to get a blessing? You can never send your way to peace. You can never send your way to freedom. You can never send your way to joy. You can never send your way to blessing. You can only receive those in surrender, in obedience. Anybody ever wrestle with God? Yeah, I have. Did you know that God blesses those wrestling matches? He doesn't shy away from them. God showed up to wrestle that guy. He showed up to wrestle with him all night. God isn't afraid to wrestle with you. Wrestle it out with him. He'd much rather you wrestle with him than run away from him. You may end up with your hip out of joint. Utterly unable to do anything in your flesh. But you'll find that you'll be completely protected and completely blessed and completely victorious. I don't know what changed or if anything changed in Esau's heart, in Esau's mind while that wrestling match was going on. But here's what we know. He left home with 400 men. When he gets there, there's no fight. There's a welcome home. I have no doubt in my mind that Jacob told his sons that story. Why his name changed, why he limped, why they had come to this place, why they possessed all this land. It was only due to God's faithfulness. It was only due to the fact that God makes a promise and God keeps a promise. And Joseph heard that. So now, when he finds himself on the back of a Midianite camel, headed to Egypt, after his brothers have just betrayed him, do you see where Joseph is? Chosen by God, but rejected by men? He's sold into slavery. What's going on in his mind? Maybe back there someplace, greater than thy faithfulness is playing in his head. Maybe he's remembering that dream that he had, that his brothers were going to bow down to him. He said, what? I'm going to slavery? He gets sold to a man of some standing in Egypt, a man by the name of Potiphar. Chapter 37, verse 36, which is where we left off last week, and you're going to say, we got through a whole nother Sunday and we haven't gotten any farther? Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. We're going to talk about that next week. Let me wrap up this week. What happens next in your Bible between chapter 36 and between chapter 37 and chapter 39 is chapter 38. Now chapter 38, that was a surprise to you, wasn't it? You didn't know that was going to pop in. But chapter 38 is like a big parenthesis. Okay? Joseph gets sold into Potiphar's house, the last verse of 37. We're picking back up in 39. All of 38 is this really weird, sordid, strange tale about Judah. It doesn't even fit chronologically in the story, because in this story, the chapter 38, Judah's a grandpa, so it's later in life. But God inserts it here in the middle of Joseph's story. And most smart preachers would just jump right over it. But you know, I'm not one of those. It's a story about Judah, who was Jacob's fourth son, Joseph's the 11th son. Judah and his widowed daughter-in-law, a lady by the name of Tamar. And I'm not going to tell you all the details of that story. You can read it if you want to. But why does God stick it in the Bible? Because I'm sure if you do read it, or if you have read it, you said, why is this even in here? We know it happened. It was true. But it's pretty weird. It is another illustration of the same theme that's stretching throughout this. And here's the theme. God's faithfulness to keep His promise. The devil's trying to mess it up as much as he can. He's trying to throw grenades in it. He's trying to blow up the plan. He's trying to destroy this family. And think about this. Judah is the one through whom Jesus is going to come. This is the lion of the tribe of Judah, right? It's a story that illustrates God's sovereignty, His divine choice, His faithfulness to His promise. Even though the devil is doing all these things and people are making stupid decisions. Judah's making a stupid decision. Tamar's making stupid. They're like the little people in the front of the screen. They're changing their story, but they're not changing the big story. Why? Because the devil's trying to mess up God's plan. Judah is going to be saved. Judah's going to be saved because Joseph's down in Potiphar's house. Which is where we'll pick it up next week. But I want to read you the first two verses of 39, then we're going to close. Chapter 39, verses 1 and 2. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken them there. Verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. We're going to see that phrase repeated many times. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph when he was in slavery. The Lord was with Joseph. Doesn't matter what the devil tries to do. Doesn't matter what decisions are made. The Lord is with him. Joseph is going to prove to be somebody who believes the Lord, who trusts the Lord, who perseveres through faith. His faith is in what God is doing. His faith is in what God has promised. God is doing something, and we're in the front of in our little spot. We're one of the extras, and we can decide I'm going to cooperate with that plan, or I can rebel against it. But God's doing something. In the end, God's plan will prevail. Why? Because God's faithful. Would you stand with me this morning? Let's pray. Lord, teach us. Teach us about us through these guys. Teach us to not run away from you, but Lord, when we have to, wrestle with you. Grab onto you and not trying to grab onto everything else, but grab onto you and not let go. In Jesus' name.